Captain Silas Blackwood had seen enough storms to know when the sea was angry. Walking the empty shores of Devil's Cove after the hurricane passed, he expected to find the usual debris, broken masts, torn sails, perhaps a few coins from some merchant's scattered cargo. What he didn't expect was the crimson parrot lying motionless in the sand, one wing twisted at an unnatural angle. Most pirates would have left the creature to die, but something about the bird's eyes, still bright despite its injuries, made Silas pause. He'd always had a peculiar fondness for wounded things, perhaps because he recognized himself in them. So he gathered the parrot gently, carried it back to his ship, and spent the next 3 weeks nursing it back to health, with rum-soaked bread and careful attention. But when the bird finally spoke, what came from its beak would change everything. Silas thought he knew about the sea and its secrets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Serpent's Tooth had been Silas Blackwood's home for nearly 2 decades, her weathered hull bearing scars from countless battles and storms. She wasn't the fastest ship on the Caribbean waters, nor the most fearsome to behold, but she was sturdy, reliable, and had never failed him when death came calling. Her black sails bore the faded image of a coiled serpent, teeth bared in eternal menace, a warning to merchant vessels and rival pirates alike. Silas carried the injured Parrot to his private quarters, a cramped cabin that served as bedroom, office, and sanctuary all in one. Maps covered every available wall space, some authentic, others cleverly forged to mislead potential thieves. A heavy oak desk dominated one corner, its surface scarred by years of plotting courses and counting plunder. Here, among the tools of his trade, he fashioned a makeshift nest from an old silk shirt, spoils from a Spanish galleon taken 3 summers past. The Parrot was magnificent, even in its wounded state. Its feathers shimmered between deep crimson and burnished gold, colors that seemed to shift, depending on how the lantern light struck them. One wing hung at an awkward angle, clearly broken, while several tail feathers had been torn away entirely. But it was the bird's eyes that captured Silas's attention, intelligent, almost knowing, as if they held secrets far beyond what any ordinary creature should possess. "Well now, little fellow," Silas murmured, carefully examining the damaged wing. "What storm brought you to my shore?" For 3 weeks Silas tended to his unusual patient, with a dedication that surprised even himself. He'd always been a practical man, hardened by years of violence and betrayal on the high sea. Sentiment was a luxury pirates couldn't afford, yet something about this creature stirred feelings he'd thought long buried. Perhaps it was the way the Parrot watched him work, never struggling against his ministrations, as if it understood his intention. Or maybe it reminded him of another wounded soul he'd once tried to save, a memory he preferred to keep locked away. His crew found their captain's behavior peculiar, to say the least. First mate, Torres, a grizzled Spaniard with more scars than teeth, made no effort to hide his confusion. "Captain, with respect, it is just a bird. We've got pressing matters. The Tortuga merchants are expecting us, and there's talk of Royal Navy patrols in these waters." Torres had served faithfully for 8 years, ever since Silas had freed him from a Spanish prison ship. He was competent, loyal, and utterly lacking in imagination, qualities that made him an excellent first mate, but a poor companion for mysteries. Magnus, the ship's cook, took a more philosophical view. A massive Norwegian with hands like ham hocks and a surprisingly gentle disposition, he often brought scraps of fish and hardtack to supplement the Parrot's diet, rum-soaked bread. "Animals know things, Captain," Magnus would say in his thick accent. "My grandmother, she had a raven that warned of storms 3 days before they struck. Perhaps this one has its own wisdom to share." The crew of 12 gave the bird a wide berth, crossing themselves when they thought no one was looking. Sailors were a superstitious lot by nature, and a crimson parrot rescued from a supernatural storm was exactly the sort of omen that kept men awake at night, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. As the days passed, the parrot's strength returned. Its wing healed cleanly, though Silas suspected it would never fly with its former grace. The bird accepted food readily and seemed to enjoy the gentle scratching behind its head that Silas provided each evening. It was during these quiet moments that Silas found himself talking to the creature, sharing thoughts he'd never spoken aloud. "You know, little one, there was a time I thought I might settle down, give up this life, find a quiet cove somewhere, maybe take up fishing." He laughed softly at his own foolishness. "Had a woman who might have waited for me if I'd been brave enough to ask. Margaret was her name, hair like spun gold and a smile that could calm the fiercest tempest." The parrot tilted its head, fixing Silas with that unnervingly intelligent stare. For a moment he could have sworn the bird understood every word, not just the sound but the meaning, the regret, the years of accumulated loneliness that no amount of treasure could fill. On the 21st day of the parrot's recovery, as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and amber, Silas entered his cabin to find the bird perched confidently on the edge of his desk. Its wing appeared fully functional, its posture alert and strong. The transformation was remarkable. What had once been a dying creature was now vibrant with renewed life. "Margaret's locket," the parrot said clearly, its voice carrying the crisp pronunciation of an educated man. "Hidden beneath the floorboards of your cabin, wrapped in blue silk, beside the letters you never sent." Silas dropped his morning coffee, the pewter mug clattering across the wooden deck as hot liquid splashed across his boots. The parrot had spoken not the mindless mimicry typical of its species, but words chosen with deliberate precision, words that cut through him like a cutlass blade. "What did you say?" Silas whispered, his weathered hands trembling as he gripped the ship's rail. The parrot preened a wing feather with casual indifference, as if discussing the weather, rather than secrets buried so deep that Silas had convinced himself they were forgotten. "The gold locket with the tiny portrait inside. You kept it even after she married the merchant from Port Royal. Even after you convinced yourself that love was a luxury you couldn't afford." The deck seemed to sway beneath Silas's feet, though the morning sea was calm as glass. No living soul knew about Margaret's locket. He'd hidden it 17 years ago after receiving word of her wedding, wrapped it in the blue silk scarf she'd given him during their brief courtship, and buried it beneath the loose floorboard where he kept his most precious possessions. He'd never spoken of it to anyone, not his crew, not his occasional companions in various ports, not even in his private moments of drunken reflection. "How do you know about that?" Silas's voice cracked like a boy's, all his years of commanding presence stripped away by a few impossible words from a bird he'd rescued from certain death. "I know many things, Captain Blackwood," the parrot replied, fixing him with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. "I know about the scar on your shoulder from the Portuguese blade that nearly took your life off the coast of Brazil. I know about the recurring nightmare where your father calls your name from beneath the wave. I know about the promise you made to your dying mother, and how you've broken it every day since." Footsteps thundered across the deck as Torres and Magnus came running, drawn by the sound of their captain's distress. They found Silas staring at the parrot with a mixture of terror and fascination, his face pale as sea foam. "Captain, what's wrong?" Torres demanded, his hand instinctively moving to the cutlass at his belt. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," Silas murmured, never taking his eyes off the crimson bird. "Tell them what you told me." The parrot remained silent, tilting its head with what could have been amusement. Minutes passed in uncomfortable quiet before Torres cleared his throat. "Captain, with respect, birds don't talk. Not like people anyway. Maybe you need some rest, some proper food. You've been working too hard caring for this creature." But Magnus crossed himself and took a step backward, his weathered face creased with worry. "My grandmother told stories of birds that carried the voices of the dead, Captain. Messengers from the spirit world, warning of things to come." "Superstitious nonsense," Torres muttered. But Silas noticed how the first mate's voice lacked conviction. "It's just a parrot. They repeat sounds they hear, nothing more." As if responding to the challenge, the bird spoke again, its voice carrying a different accent now, cultured, aristocratic, nothing like Silas's own rough tones. "Your crucifix is tarnishing, Señor Torres. The silver turns black when the supernatural draws near. Perhaps you should examine it more closely. Torres's hand flew to the small cross hanging around his neck, his fingers finding the once bright silver now dark as midnight. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a man who'd glimpsed his own grave. Dios mío, he whispered, backing toward the ship's rail. What manner of devil have you brought aboard our ship? Not a devil, the parrot said calmly, beginning to preen its other wing. Merely a keeper of secrets, a guardian of truth that men prefer to forget. I have much to tell you, Captain Blackwood, if you have the courage to listen. Magnus made the sign of the cross again, his massive hands shaking like leaves in a hurricane. Captain, maybe we should put the bird ashore. Some mysteries are too dangerous to keep aboard a ship. But Silas found himself drawn forward despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. The parrot's words about Margaret had torn open old wounds, but they'd also awakened something he'd thought lost forever. If this creature knew his deepest secrets, perhaps it knew other things as well. Perhaps it held answers to questions he'd carried for decades. What else do you know? Silas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The parrot fixed him with those knowing eyes and smiled. If a bird could be said to smile, everything, Captain. I know where the dead bury their gold. The parrot perched motionless on Silas's shoulder as the captain paced his quarters, the bird's claws gripping the worn leather of his coat with surprising gentleness. 3 days had passed since that first impossible conversation, and the creature had remained stubbornly silent, despite Silas's increasingly desperate attempts to coax more revelations from its beak. You spoke of treasure, Silas said for the 100th time, his voice hoarse from repetition. The dead and their gold. What did you mean? The parrot preened a wing feather with maddening indifference, as if the secrets of the Caribbean were of no more consequence than the morning tide. Outside, Silas could hear his crew going about their duties with unusual quiet, their conversations conducted in whispers and worried glances. Word of the talking bird had spread throughout the ship despite his orders for silence. Torres knocked on the cabin door with the precise rhythm they'd established years ago. 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones. Captain, we need to discuss our heading. The men are growing restless. Enter, Silas called, and his first mate stepped inside, carefully avoiding eye contact with the crimson bird. Sir, we've been anchored in this cove for nearly a week. The crew expects action, not whatever this is. Torres gestured vaguely toward the parrot, his face twisted with barely concealed distaste. Some of the men are talking of putting ashore at the next port, finding berths, on ships with captains who haven't lost their minds to supernatural nonsense. Before Silas could respond, the parrot's head snapped up with sudden alertness. When it spoke, its voice carried an entirely different quality, older, warier, tinged with authority, that made both men straighten involuntarily. The bone map rests in the coral caves beneath Tortuga's eastern cliffs, where Captain Redbeard hid it 30 summers past. Carved from the jawbone of a whale that swallowed 3 men whole, inscribed with the blood of those he betrayed. 3 locations marked in crimson, each guarded by more than mortal means. Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Every pirate worth his salt knew the legend of Redbeard's treasure, a hoard so vast it could buy a small kingdom, so well hidden that dozens of men had died searching for even a hint of its location. But Redbeard himself had vanished without a trace. 28 years ago, taking his secrets to what everyone assumed was a watery grave. You're speaking of myths, Torres said, though his voice lacked conviction. Bedtime stories to frighten cabin boys. The parrot fixed the first mate with those unsettling eyes. Captain Miguel Santos believed it was myth when he tortured 3 of Redbeard's crew on the beaches of Nassau. The screams carried for miles, but the men died with their lips sealed. Santos never found so much as a single doubloon. Silas's blood turned to ice water in his veins. Miguel Santos had been his father's name, though the man had never spoken of torturing anyone for treasure. His father had died when Silas was barely 15, taking his own secrets to the grave and leaving behind only debts, enemies, and a reputation for ruthless ambition. How do you know that name? Silas whispered. I know because I was there. The parrot replied, its voice now carrying the weight of profound sadness. I watched from the shadows as Santos used fire and blade to extract information that wasn't his to take. I witnessed Redbeard's final moments, heard his dying curse, saw the darkness that claimed his soul. Torres crossed himself again, his tarnished crucifix catching what little light filtered through the cabin's small porthole. Captain, this creature speaks of events before its times. No bird lives 30 years, and certainly not with such clarity. Perhaps not, the parrot agreed, turning its attention to a loose thread on Silas's coat sleeve. But souls endure longer than flesh, and some spirits find unexpected vessels when their earthly forms fail them. The caves I speak of lie 60 fathoms below the surface, accessible only at the lowest tide when the moon is dark. The bone map bears 3 marks: Skull Island to the north, Mermaid's Rest to the east, and Storm's End far to the south. Silas found himself reaching for the charts scattered across his desk, his fingers tracing familiar coastlines with new purpose. Tortuga lay 2 days sailing to the northwest, and the moon would be dark in less than a week. If the parrot spoke truly, and God help him, he was beginning to believe it did, then the greatest treasure hunt in Caribbean history was about to begin. The map alone is worth a fortune, the parrot continued, its voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But beware, Captain. Redbeard's dying curse protects more than gold and silver. Some treasures extract a price in blood, and the sins of fathers cast long shadows across their children's paths. The crew gathered on deck as the sun reached its zenith, their faces bearing the grim expressions of men who'd reached the limits of their tolerance. Silas stood before them with the parrot perched on his shoulder, feeling the weight of 20 years of leadership hanging in the balance. These were good men, loyal sailors who'd followed him through storms both literal and figurative. But every man had his breaking point. Captain, spoke Jenkins, the ship's gunner, his voice respectful but firm. We've served faithfully under your command, but this situation grows beyond what any Christian man should endure. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled crew. Even Magnus, usually the most steadfast of his men, avoided meeting Silas's eyes. The massive cook's hands worked nervously at the hem of his apron, a gesture Silas recognized as profound distress. The compass spins like a child's top, complained Hartwell, the navigator. North points south, east becomes west. How can we plot a course when the very lodestone rebels against nature? Silas had noticed the compass's erratic behavior, but had attributed it to damaged mechanisms rather than supernatural interference. Now, watching his men's frightened faces, he began to understand the true scope of their terror. It wasn't merely the talking bird that unnerved them. It was the accumulation of inexplicable events that had plagued the ship since the parrot's arrival. The rats have abandoned the ship, added Briggs, the youngest of the crew at barely 19. Found them swimming toward shore 3 nights past. Every last one of them. Rats don't abandon a seaworthy vessel unless death itself walks the decks. Torres stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the responsibility of speaking for the crew. Captain, we've followed you into battles that should have killed us all. We've sailed through hurricanes that would have claimed lesser men. But this creature brings omens that no sailor should ignore. As if summoned by the conversation, the parrot spoke in its unnaturally clear voice. Fear is wisdom when death wears feathers, gentlemen. But consider this. Would you abandon the greatest treasure in the Caribbean because shadows frighten you more than poverty? Several men crossed themselves at the bird's words, while others took involuntary steps backward. Jenkins's hand moved to the pistol at his belt, though whether for protection or desperate action, Silas couldn't determine. It speaks of treasure, whispered Hartwell, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. But at what cost? My grandfather told stories of cursed gold that turned men into walking corpses, of ships that sailed forever without reaching port. The parrot tilted its head with what seemed like amusement. Your grandfather was wise to fear cursed gold, Navigator Hartwell, but he was also the man who stole 3 emeralds from a Spanish church in Cartagena, was he not? The stones he hid in his boot heel, the ones that bought his passage to the colonies when the Inquisition came calling. Hartwell's face went pale as ship's canvas. How could you possibly know that? My grandfather died before I was born. Those emeralds were sold to buy his freedom, and he never spoke of them to a living soul. The dead speak to those who know how to listen, the parrot replied calmly. And I have had many years to perfect that particular skill. Magnus finally found his voice, though it trembled like a leaf in a storm. Captain, my grandfather's stories spoke of spirits that possessed animals to complete unfinished business. If this creature carries the soul of one who died violently, it may bring the wrath of the damned upon us all, or it may bring the greatest fortune any of you have ever dreamed of, the parrot countered. The bone map I described holds the locations of 3 separate treasures, each worth more than all your combined plunder from 20 years of raiding. Spanish gold, Aztec silver, jewels torn from the crowns of dead kings. Silas could see the war being waged behind his men's eyes, greed battling against superstition, practical need wrestling with mortal fear. These were pirates, after all, men who'd chosen a life of risk and reward over the safety of honest labor. The promise of unimaginable wealth carried its own powerful magic. If we follow this path, Torres said slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of command decisions, and these omens prove true, what becomes of our souls? What becomes of men who traffic with the supernatural for worldly gain? The parrot's response came in a voice so ancient and weary that it seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. Your souls were forfeit the moment you chose the pirate's life. My friends, the only question now is whether you'll die poor men or wealthy ones. The decision to sail for Tortuga came at dawn, sealed not by Silas's authority, but by the crew's grudging acceptance that supernatural terror might be preferable to a lifetime of wondering what riches they'd abandoned. The Serpent's Tooth cut through calm Caribbean waters under full sail, her black canvas billowing like the wings of some great predatory bird. Silas stood at the helm, the mysterious parrot perched on his shoulder as it had been for the past 2 days. The bird seemed to take genuine pleasure in the wind ruffling its crimson feathers, occasionally spreading its wings to catch the sea breeze. For moments at a time it almost seemed like an ordinary creature, until it spoke with voices that belonged to the dead. 3 degrees starboard, the parrot murmured in Silas's ear, its voice carrying the authority of someone who'd sailed these waters countless times. The current runs stronger there, and the wind will hold steady until sunset. Silas adjusted their heading, without question, having learned that the bird's navigational advice proved unnaturally accurate. Their compass still spun wildly whenever they consulted it, but the parrot's guidance had kept them on course through waters that should have been treacherous for a ship sailing blind. Torres approached with the careful steps of a man walking on unstable ground. "Captain, there's smoke on the horizon to port. Could be a ship, could be an island settlement. Should we investigate?" Through his spyglass, Silas could make out the distinctive lines of a 3-masted ship moving parallel to their course. Even at this distance, he recognized the configuration, a Spanish galleon, heavily armed and flying colors, that marked her as a vessel of significant importance. "That's the Santa Magdalena," the parrot said before Silas could focus the glass properly. "Captain Eduardo Vasquez, commanding. She carries silver from the mines of Potosi, bound for Cadiz with an escort of 2 smaller vessels following at a distance." Silas swept the horizon with his spyglass and found the escort ships exactly where the parrot had predicted, their sails barely visible against the morning haze. The Santa Magdalena alone would represent a prize worth several years of normal piracy, but attacking a heavily defended convoy would require careful planning and considerable risk. "How do you know their cargo?" Silas whispered, lowering the spyglass with hands that trembled slightly. "Captain Vasquez's wife keeps detailed records of every shipment," the parrot replied. "Conversationally, she fears her husband's gambling debts will consume their family fortune, so she maintains secret accounts of all royal cargo. The Santa Magdalena carries 43 chests of silver ingots, 12 barrels of raw silver dust, and a small fortune in worked silver artifacts destined for the Spanish court. The temptation was enormous. Such a prize could set his crew up for life, eliminate the need to pursue mythical treasure maps and supernatural mysteries. But something in the Parrot's tone suggested a trap, a test of priorities that carried consequences beyond simple success or failure. "We hold our course for Tortuga," Silas announced, his voice carrying across the deck. "The silver will find its way to Spain or the bottom of the sea, but either way it's not our concern today." Several crew members exchanged glances of surprise and disappointment. Magnus nodded approvingly, while Torres looked as though he wanted to question the decision, but lacked the courage to challenge his captain's judgment publicly. The Parrot remained silent as they sailed past the distant galleon, but Silas caught what might have been approval in its ancient eyes. As the afternoon wore on, the bird began to speak of Tortuga's history, its voice shifting between different accents and speech patterns, as if channeling various long-dead inhabitants. The caves beneath the eastern cliffs were carved by Spanish prisoners in 1642, it said in the cultured tones of an educated man. 12 men worked for 3 months, hollowing out chambers large enough to hide entire shiploads of plunder. Only 3 survived the work, and Captain Redbeard killed them all to keep the location secret. Later, speaking with the rough dialect of a common sailor, the entrance is hidden behind a curtain of seaweed at the lowest tide. Looks like nothing more than a crack in the rock, but it opens into a cathedral of stone that could hold a dozen ships. And finally, in a voice so cold it made Silas's blood freeze, "The guardian that Redbeard left behind still walks those chambers. Neither fully dead nor completely alive, it serves as eternal sentry over treasures that rightfully belong to the grave." As evening approached, the distinctive silhouette of Tortuga appeared on the horizon, its mountainous profile dark against the setting sun. Silas had visited the notorious pirate haven dozens of times over the years, but never with such a sense of foreboding mixed with desperate anticipation. The Parrot stirred restlessly on his shoulder as they drew closer to shore. "Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark and the tide runs lowest, we descend into the depths. But remember, Captain, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." The moon hung like a dark omen in the star-studded sky, as Silas and 3 of his most trusted crew members rowed through the midnight waters toward Tortuga's eastern cliffs. The Parrot perched silently in the bow of their small boat, its crimson feathers barely visible in the darkness. Behind them, the Serpent's Tooth waited at anchor, her crew nervously watching for any sign of trouble. "There," the Parrot whispered, its voice cutting through the gentle splash of oars. 20 yards to starboard, where the cliff face appears to fold in upon itself." Silas squinted through the darkness, seeing nothing but jagged rock and the phosphorescent foam of waves breaking against stone. But as they drew closer, the tide at its lowest ebb revealed what daylight would have hidden. A narrow cleft in the cliff face, barely wide enough for their small boat, concealed behind a curtain of trailing seaweed. Torres crossed himself as they approached the hidden entrance. "Captain, this feels like sailing into the mouth of hell itself." Magnus pulled steady strokes at the oars, his massive frame dwarfing the small vessel. "My grandmother always said the devil hides his treasures in the deepest places, where honest men fear to tread." "Your grandmother was wiser than she knew," the Parrot replied, its voice carrying an otherworldly echo as they passed between the narrow walls of stone. "But she also taught you that courage and caution are not opposites, did she not?" The brave man acknowledges his fear and acts despite it. Young Briggs, chosen for this expedition despite his 19 years, gripped his lantern with white knuckles. How can it know what Magnus's grandmother taught him? She died when he was barely 10 years old. "The dead remember what the living forget," the Parrot said simply, as their boat emerged into a vast underground chamber that defied imagination. Silas held his breath as Briggs raised the lantern, its flickering light revealing a cathedral of stone that stretched beyond the reach of their illumination. Stalactites hung like the teeth of some enormous beast, while the water beneath their boat reflected the light in patterns that seemed to move with their own mysterious purpose. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," Torres whispered, his voice echoing off the chamber walls with supernatural resonance. This place was carved by more than human hands. The parrot guided them through the labyrinthine waterways with the confidence of long familiarity, directing them past submerged rocks and hidden channels that would have torn the bottom from their boat. The air grew thick and humid, carrying scents of brine and something else, something ancient and vaguely threatening. There, the parrot announced as their lantern light revealed a narrow shelf of stone rising from the dark water. Captain Redbeard's fictional sanctuary. They pulled their boat onto the makeshift dock, the scrape of wood against stone echoing ominously through the vast chamber. Silas stepped carefully onto the slick surface, his boots struggling for purchase on stone, worn smooth by decades of tidal action. The parrot flew ahead, its wings silent as death as it landed beside what appeared to be a natural formation of rock. But as Silas approached with the lantern held high, he could see that the stones had been carefully arranged, fitted together with the precision of a master mason. The fourth stone from the left at the height of a man's chest, the parrot instructed, press firmly while speaking the words blood and bone, sea and stone. Silas hesitated, his rational mind rebelling against the madness of taking orders from a bird that claimed knowledge of events predating its existence. But they had come too far to retreat now, invested too much in this supernatural gamble to abandon it at the moment of truth. His fingers found the designated stone, and at his touch, it gave way slightly, revealing itself to be more mechanism than mere rock. As he spoke the ancient words, feeling foolish but determined, hidden gears turned with the grinding sound of disuse, and a section of the wall swung inward on hinges, carved from living stone. Beyond lay a smaller chamber, dry and filled with air that tasted of centuries, and there, resting on a pedestal of carved whalebone, lay a map, unlike anything Silas had ever seen. The bone was yellow with age, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and move in the lantern light. 3 locations were marked in what looked like dried blood, crimson stains that remained vivid despite the passage of decades. Strange symbols surrounded each mark, written in languages that belonged to no nation Silas recognized. The jawbone of Leviathan, the parrot said reverently, landing beside the ancient artifact, carved with tools blessed by practitioners of arts that honest men should never learn. The blood that marks those locations was taken from Redbeard's own heart as he lay dying, mixed with seawater and the tears of his betrayed crew. Silas reached toward the map with trembling hands, feeling power radiating from the bone like heat from a forge. The moment his fingers made contact, images flooded his mind, visions of tropical islands, underground chambers filled with gold, and something else, something that made his soul recoil in terror. The parrot's voice cut through Silas's supernatural visions like a blade through fog. The diary lies beneath the map, Captain. Captain Redbeard's final testament, written in his own blood as death claimed him. Silas's hands shook as he lifted the bone map, revealing a leather-bound journal so old it seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. The cover bore stains that could only be blood, and the pages within were filled with handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as it progressed, as if penned by a man fighting against time and mortal injury. "Read it aloud," the parrot commanded, its voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. The dead deserved to have their stories heard by the living. With trembling fingers, Silas opened the diary to its first page. The date inscribed at the top made his blood run cold. It was from exactly 30 years ago, the day his father had disappeared during what Miguel Santos claimed was a routine trading voyage. The 23rd day of September, in the year of our Lord 1693, Silas read, his voice echoing strangely in the ancient chamber. "I am Captain Edmund Redbeard, and I write these words knowing they may be my last. The men I trusted as brothers have shown their true nature, and the gold that was to secure my family's future has become the instrument of my doom." Torres crossed himself as the words seemed to hang in the air like physical things. Captain, perhaps some secrets are meant to stay buried. But the parrot fixed the first mate with those unnaturally knowing eyes. Continue reading, Captain Blackwood. Your father's role in this tale has yet to be revealed. Silas's throat constricted, but he pressed on, each word feeling like a stone dropped into still water. Miguel Santos came to me with promises of partnership, speaking of mutual profit and shared enterprise. His silver tongue painted pictures of wealth beyond imagination, of treasures that could buy kingdoms. But I have learned too late that Santos serves only his own greed, and his partnership extends only so far as his ability to use other men for his purposes. The lantern flickered as if responding to the ancient words, casting dancing shadows across the chamber walls. Silas could feel the weight of destiny settling around him like a shroud, connecting his present to events that had occurred before his birth. Santos brought two others with him, his brother Carlos and a young man named William Thorne, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, but already showing the ruthless ambition that marks a true predator. They spoke of splitting the treasure equally, of establishing a new kind of piracy based on cooperation rather than betrayal. Fools that we were, we believed them. Magnus shifted uncomfortably in the shadows. Captain, this Thorne, was that not your mother's family name? Silas nodded grimly, pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed, beginning to form a terrible picture. His mother had indeed been born a Thorne, though she'd rarely spoken of her family's history. Now he began to understand why. The trap was sprung on the beach of Dead Man's Cay. Silas continued reading, his voice growing stronger despite his inner turmoil. Santos claimed the Spanish had discovered our hideout, that we needed to move the treasure immediately. But it was Santos himself who had betrayed our location. Santos who brought the Spanish soldiers to ensure no witnesses would survive to expose his treachery. The parrot spoke in a voice filled with ancient sadness. I was there, Cap. I watched from the palm trees as your father and his companions tortured good men for information they already possessed. I heard Redbeard's dying curse, witnessed the darkness that claimed his soul as justice was denied. My crew fought bravely, the diary continued, but we were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Santos had planned every detail with diabolic precision. One by one, my loyal men fell, their blood staining the sand red as sunset. And when only I remained, Santos and his companions took turns with heated irons and sharpened blades, demanding the locations of my hidden caches. Silas's hands began to shake so violently he could barely hold the journal steady. But I had prepared for such betrayal. The true treasure maps I had hidden in 3 separate locations, protected by guardians that would test the worthiness of any who sought to claim what was mine. The maps they tortured from my lips were false, leading only to empty caves and cursed ground. Redbeard's final act of defiance, the parrot said with something approaching admiration. He sent your father and his companions on a fool's errand that cost them months of searching, and eventually their lives. The sea claimed Santos when his ship foundered in a hurricane while following the false directions. Justice delayed, perhaps, but not denied. The final entry in the diary was barely legible, written in a hand growing weak with approaching death. To whoever finds these words, know that I die with my secrets intact, but I do not die unavenged. The curse I place upon my murderers will follow them and their bloodlines until the debt is paid in full. The treasure they killed for will remain forever beyond their reach, protected by guardians more terrible than any earthly force. Silas closed the diary with hands that had gone numb with shock and recognition. His father's death at sea, previously attributed to natural disaster, now revealed itself as supernatural justice. The sins of the father, as the parrot had warned, cast long shadows indeed. The revelation of his father's sins struck Silas like a physical blow, leaving him gasping in the stale air of the ancient chamber. But the parrot was far from finished with its terrible revelation. Your father's cutlass hangs above your bunk, aboard the Serpent's Tooth, the bird said, its voice carrying the weight of inexorable fate. The blade that took 3 innocent lives on the beach of Dead Man's Cay. Look closely at the crossguard when you return to your ship, Captain. Look for the mark that brands all those touched by Redbeard's curse. Silas's mind raced back to the sword he'd inherited upon his father's death, a beautiful weapon with an ornate crossguard that bore what he'd always assumed was decorative etching. With the diary's revelations burning in his memory, he began to recall details he'd previously overlooked, how the metal sometimes seemed to tarnish overnight despite careful maintenance, how it grew unnaturally cold during storms, how his father had warned him never to draw the blade in anger. The curse follows bloodlines, Torres whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. If your father was marked, then you am marked as well, Silas finished grimly. The sins of the father visited upon the son, as the good book warns us. Magnus crossed himself with his massive hands. Captain, perhaps this is why the bird came to you. Perhaps it seeks to break the curse rather than perpetuate it. The parrot turned those ancient eyes toward the Norwegian cook. Wisdom often hides in the simplest observations. Magnus Eriksson, your grandmother would be proud to see how her teachings have taken root. But why now? Silas demanded, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. Why reveal these secrets after 30 years of silence? My father is long dead, his crimes buried with his bones. Because the treasure remains, the parrot replied simply, and because Redbeard's curse was specific in its terms. The bloodline of Miguel Santos must either claim the treasure through worthy deeds or forfeit it forever when the last male heir dies without proving his worth. The implications hit Silas like a cannon blast. I'm the last male heir. Indeed, your father sired no other sons, and you have chosen the bachelor's life over marriage and family. Should you die without claiming Redbeard's legacy through honorable means, the treasure will be lost forever, sinking beneath the waves to join its creator in the depths. Torres stepped forward, his loyalty warring with obvious fear. Captain, if this curse is real, then pursuing the treasure could mean your death. Perhaps we should abandon this quest, return to honest piracy, let sleeping secrets lie, and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Silas shook his head. No, my friend, my father's sins have haunted me without my knowledge for 30 years. At least now I understand the weight I've been carrying. Young Briggs, who had remained silent throughout the revelations, finally found his voice. But Captain, if the curse demands worthy deeds, how do we know what constitutes worthiness? What if we're simply walking into another trap? The parrot preened a wing feather with what might have been amusement. The answer lies in the nature of the treasures themselves, young Briggs. Each of the 3 locations holds more than gold and silver. They contain artifacts of power, objects that can be used for great good or terrible evil, depending on the character of those who claim them. Silas studied the bone map more carefully, noting how the 3 blood-marked locations formed a triangle across the Caribbean. Tell us about these artifacts. The first island, Skull Rock to the north, holds the golden hourglass of Tempest, a device that can control the tides themselves, bringing calm seas to those who use it wisely or devastating storms to those who abuse its power. The second, Mermaid's Rest to the east, guards the Siren's Shell, which grants dominion over all sea creatures but demands a price in compassion from its wielder. The third, Storm's End to the south, conceals the Crown of Storms, which commands the very weather but tests the humility of any who would wear it. Magnus whistled low under his breath. Artifacts of legend, objects that could change the balance of power across the entire Caribbean, or destroy anyone foolish enough to seek them for selfish gain. Torres added darkly. The parrot spread its wings in what seemed like a gesture of finality. The choice is yours, Captain Blackwood. You can attempt to claim your father's legacy and prove that redemption is possible, even for the cursed, or you can flee from the truth and allow your bloodline's shame to follow you to your grave. Silas looked around the chamber at his trusted companions, men who had followed him into dangers that would have broken lesser sailors. Now he was asking them to risk not just their lives, but their very souls in pursuit of treasures that might be more burden than blessing. The decision affects us all, he said finally. "I won't order any man to follow me on this path. Those who wish to return to the ship and sail away from this madness are free to do so without judgment or consequence." None of his men moved toward the boat. Skull Island rose from the Caribbean waters like a monument to death itself, its rocky peaks forming the unmistakable silhouette that had given the place its ominous name. As the Serpent's Tooth approached the island's treacherous shoreline, Silas could see why generations of pirates had avoided this cursed place, despite rumors of treasure hidden within its depths. The water around the island defied nature itself. While the rest of the Caribbean sparkled blue-green in the morning sun, the sea surrounding Skull Island remained dark as midnight, its surface occasionally disturbed by movements that suggested creatures far larger than any fish known to inhabit these waters. "The tide's wrong," Hartwell muttered, consulting his charts with growing confusion. "According to my calculations, it should be high tide for another 3 hours, but the water level around the island suggests low tide." The Parrot spoke from its perch on Silas Arauge's shoulder, its voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the island's supernatural nature. "Time flows differently here, Navigator. The island exists partially outside the normal flow of hours and seasons. What you see is not the tide as it is, but as it will be when the golden hourglass chooses to reveal itself." Torres supervised the lowering of the ship's boat with obvious reluctance. "Captain, perhaps we should wait until we better understand this place. Rushing into supernatural danger serves no one." But even as he spoke, the dark waters around the island began to churn with increasing violence. What had appeared to be gentle swells moments before transformed into towering waves that crashed against the Serpent's Tooth's hull with bone-jarring force. "The island knows we're here," the Parrot announced calmly. "It's testing our resolve before we even set foot on its shores. Turn back now, and you'll sail away safely but empty-handed. Press forward, and you'll face trials that will test everything you believe about courage and worthiness." Silas gripped the ship's rail as another massive wave nearly knocked him from his feet. Around him, his crew worked desperately to keep the vessel steady in waters that seemed determined to drag them to the bottom. "Magnus, Briggs, Torres, you're with me," Silas shouted over the howling wind that had appeared from nowhere. "The rest of you keep the ship steady. If we don't return by sunset, sail for Port Royal and don't look back." The journey to shore became a battle against forces both natural and supernatural. Their small boat was tossed like driftwood in the churning waters, while phantom winds tried to drive them toward jagged rocks that jutted from the sea like the teeth of some enormous beast. But the Parrot's guidance proved invaluable, its voice cutting through the chaos with precise directions that somehow led them safely to a narrow beach of black sand. The moment they pulled their boat onto the shore, the supernatural storm ceased as abruptly as it had begun. The sea returned to its unnatural calm, and the wind died to a whisper that carried unsettling voices, speaking in languages no living man should recognize. "Welcome to Skull Island," the Parrot said with what might have been dark humor, "where the dead outnumber the living by a considerable margin." The beach stretched before them like a carpet of crushed charcoal, unmarked by footprints or any sign of life. Behind the sand, a jungle of twisted trees rose toward the island's rocky peaks, their branches intertwined in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than natural growth. "The path lies straight ahead," the Parrot continued, "but do not be deceived by appearances. This island will test each of you differently, showing you visions designed to break your will and send you fleeing back to the sea." As they entered the jungle, the very air seemed to thicken around them. Magnus wiped sweat from his brow despite the shade provided by the canopy overhead. "Captain, something's not right about this place. The trees, they're watching us." Indeed, the twisted trunks did seem to shift and move when observed from the corner of the eye, while the leaves rustled with whispers that formed no recognizable words. Briggs stumbled over a root that hadn't been there moments before, catching himself just before falling into what appeared to be a pit filled with bones. "Stay close together," Silas commanded, his hand resting on his father's cursed cutlass. "Whatever this place shows you, remember that we came here by choice, and we'll leave the same way." But even as he spoke, The jungle around them began to change. The twisted trees straightened into familiar masts, their branches becoming rigging and sails. The black sand beneath their feet transformed into weathered deck planking, and suddenly they found themselves standing aboard a ship Silas recognized with a shock of terror. It was his father's vessel, the Santa Esperanza, exactly as it had appeared on the day Miguel Santos had sailed away to his death 30 years ago. But this ghostly recreation was populated by figures that moved with the jerky motions of marionettes controlled by an amateur puppeteer. "No," Silas whispered, understanding what the island intended to show him. "I won't watch this. I won't relive my father's crimes." But the spectral scene played out despite his protests. He watched in horror as phantom figures that bore his father's face and voice tortured ghostly representations of Redbeard's crew, their screams echoing across the impossible ship with the authenticity of remembered anguish. The spectral vision of his father's crimes shattered like glass when the first cannonball screamed overhead, exploding against the twisted trees with devastating force. Silas threw himself to the jungle floor, pulling his companions down with him as debris rained from the canopy above. "Real cannon fire," Torres gasped, spitting dirt and leaves from his mouth. But from where? The Parrot spread its wings for balance as another volley thundered across the island. "Captain Iron-Tooth Gareth has arrived ahead of schedule. It seems your reputation for finding treasure has preceded you, Captain Blackwood." Through the smoke and chaos, Silas could hear the distinctive boom of hellfire, Iron-Tooth's legendary cannon that was said never to miss its intended target. The weapon had been forged, according to legend, from metal taken from a fallen star and blessed by a dying witch who cursed it to bring death to all who opposed its owner. "How did he know we were coming here?" Briggs demanded, his young face pale with fear and confusion. The Parrot's response carried a tone of grim satisfaction. "Because Torres has been sending messages to Gareth for the past month, keeping your rival informed of your every move and discovery." Silas spun toward his first mate, his hand moving instinctively to his cutlass. Torres's face had gone ashen, but his eyes held no surprise at the revelation, only the resigned look of a man whose betrayal had finally been exposed. "Torres?" Silas's voice carried more hurt than anger, the pain of a friendship shattered, cutting deeper than any blade. "I had no choice, Captain," Torres said, backing away with his hands raised defensively. "My daughter in Cartagena, Gareth holds her hostage. He promised she would die slowly if I didn't provide information about your activities." Magnus rose to his full imposing height, his massive hands clenched into fists. "You betrayed us all for the sake of one person? What of our lives? What of our loyalty to each other?" Easy words from a man who has no family. Torres shot back, desperation making him reckless. "You've never held your child in your arms, never promised to protect them from all harm. When that promise is threatened, loyalty becomes a luxury you cannot afford." Another cannon blast shook the jungle, closer this time, and Silas could hear the sound of men crashing through the underbrush. Gareth had landed a shore party, and they were moving inland with the efficiency of experienced hunters tracking wounded prey. "The golden hourglass lies at the island's heart," the Parrot announced urgently, "in a chamber beneath the skull-shaped rock formation at the highest peak. But Gareth's men will reach it first if we waste time on recriminations and betrayal." Silas looked at Torres, the man who had shared 1,000 dangers with him, who had pulled him from the sea during the hurricane off Jamaica, who had stood beside him in battles that should have killed them both. The betrayal cut deep, but the immediate threat demanded pragmatic response rather than emotional reaction. "You'll guide us to the chamber," Silas told Torres, his voice cold as winter ocean. "And if we survive this, you'll have a chance to explain yourself fully. But for now, your knowledge of this crew's capabilities makes you valuable despite your treachery." Torres nodded gratefully, understanding that his captain was offering him a chance at redemption. Even as Gareth's men drew closer through the supernatural jungle, they moved inland with desperate urgency, the Parrot providing guidance through paths that shifted and changed with each step. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily louder, Iron Tooth's crew calling to each other in the harsh voices of men accustomed to violence and cruelty. There the Parrot announced as they emerged from the jungle onto a barren slope of black rock. Above them rose the skull-shaped formation that gave the island its name, its empty eye sockets staring blindly across the Caribbean waters. But they were not alone on the slope. Iron Tooth Gareth himself stood blocking their path, his legendary cannon Hellfire, mounted on a wheeled carriage and aimed directly at Silas's heart. The weapon was a thing of terrible beauty, its barrel inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly, its touch apparently causing the very air around it to shimmer with unnatural heat. "Captain Blackwood," Gareth called out, his voice carrying the refined accent of a man born to privilege who had chosen the pirate's life for reasons other than desperation. "How pleasant to encounter you in this delightfully atmospheric location. I trust your journey here has been educational." Iron Tooth was everything Silas was not. Tall where Silas was compact, elegant where Silas was practical, coldly intellectual where Silas relied on instinct and experience. His nickname came not from dental work, but from the iron teeth he'd had installed after losing his natural ones in a sword fight, giving his smile a predatory quality that unnerved even hardened pirates. "Gareth," Silas replied, calculating distances and angles while keeping his voice conversational. "Still compensating for your inadequacies with oversized weapons. I see." The iron teeth flashed in a humorless grin. "Still relying on crude humor to mask your fear, I observe. But we needn't trade insults like common tavern brawlers. You have something I want, and I have something you need specifically. The continued existence of your crew." The entrance to the skull chamber lay hidden behind a wall of black stone that had been carved with symbols predating any known civilization. As Silas approached the ancient barrier, the Parrot spoke in a voice heavy with otherworldly knowledge. "Place your hand upon the central glyph and speak the words that bind sea to sky, time to tide. But know that crossing this threshold will awaken guardians that have slept for centuries." Silas pressed his palm against the cold stone, feeling power thrumming beneath the surface like a heartbeat. The words came to him as if whispered by the wind itself. "Tempus fugit, mera permanit." Time flees, the sea endures. The stone wall dissolved like morning mist, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into the island's heart. Phosphorescent moss provided an eerie blue-green glow that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some cosmic force, while the air carried the scent of deep ocean and something indefinably ancient. "Captain," Torres whispered, his betrayal temporarily forgotten in the face of supernatural mystery, "the very stones are singing." Indeed, a low harmonic resonance filled the chamber, as if the island itself were humming with barely contained power. The Parrot spread its wings and took flight, leading them down the spiraling path toward whatever waited in the depths. They emerged into a vast circular chamber whose domed ceiling was carved with constellations that moved and shifted as they watched. At the center of the room, on a pedestal of white coral, sat the golden hourglass, an artifact of such perfect beauty that it seemed to glow with its own internal light. But they were not alone in the chamber. Translucent figures stood guard around the pedestal, the ghostly forms of pirates, who had died seeking this very treasure. Their faces bore expressions of eternal longing, hands reaching toward the hourglass they could never touch. "The guardians of greed," the Parrot announced solemnly. "Men who came here seeking wealth for its own sake, now condemned to eternal watching. They cannot harm the worthy, but they will tear apart any who approach with impure motive." Magnus crossed himself as one of the spectral pirates, turned toward them, its hollow eyes fixing on the Norwegian with disturbing intensity. "Captain, how do we know if our motives are pure enough? How do we prove worthiness to the dead?" Before Silas could answer, the chamber's entrance blazed with sudden light as Iron Tooth Gareth and his crew burst into the room, weapons drawn and faces flushed with the excitement of imminent victory. "Stand aside, Blackwood," Gareth commanded, his iron teeth gleaming in the phosphorescent glow. "That artifact belongs to the strongest, not the most sentimental." But as Gareth's men advanced toward the pedestal, the ghostly guardians moved with sudden, terrible purpose. Their translucent forms became solid as iron. Their phantom weapons gained cutting edges sharp as diamond. The first of Gareth's pirates to reach the hourglass found himself impaled on a spectral cutlass, his scream of agony echoing off the chamber walls as his life force was drained away. "Fools," the parrot observed, with clinical detachment. "The guardians can sense the darkness in men's hearts. Gareth's crew carries the stench of innocent blood, the weight of crimes committed for pleasure rather than necessity." Iron Tooth himself proved more cunning than his men. Instead of advancing directly on the treasure, he aimed his cursed cannon Hellfire at the chamber's ceiling, where the moving constellations painted their eternal dance. "If I cannot claim the prize," he snarled, "then neither shall anyone else. Hellfire will bring this entire chamber down upon our heads." The parrot's voice cut through the chaos with urgent authority. "The hourglass can control time itself, Captain. In the right hands it can freeze moments, accelerate healing, even reverse the flow of seconds, but it must be claimed by one who understands that true power serves others rather than the self." Silas found himself caught between advancing ghostly guardians. Iron Tooth threatened destruction of the chamber, and his own uncertainty about his worthiness to claim such a powerful artifact. The weight of his father's sins pressed down upon him like a physical burden. But then he thought of his crew loyal Magnus, who had followed him into supernatural danger, young Briggs, who trusted his captain's judgment despite his own fear, even Torres, whose betrayal had been motivated by love rather than greed. These men deserved a leader who would risk everything for their welfare. With newfound resolve, Silas strode toward the pedestal, ignoring the ghostly guardians who parted before him like morning fog. His hands closed around the golden glass, and immediately he felt its power flowing through him, the ability to slow time to a crawl, to see the threads that connected all moments past and future. The chamber erupted in supernatural chaos as Gareth fired his cursed cannon. The spectral guardians turned their attention to the remaining invaders, and time itself began to bend and twist around the activated artifact. The journey to Mermaid's Rest took 3 days through waters that grew stranger with each passing hour. The golden hourglass secured in Silas's cabin seemed to affect the very nature of time around the serpent's tooth. Sunsets lasted hours while dawn broke in moments, and the crew found themselves aging and growing younger in subtle cycles that left everyone disoriented and unsettled. The parrot perched on the ship's wheel, its crimson feathers now showing flecks of silver that hadn't been there before. When it spoke, its voice carried a different quality, older, more weary, as if the revelation of supernatural secrets was draining some essential energy from its mysterious existence. "The second island approaches," the bird announced as a green smudge appeared on the horizon. Mermaid's Rest, where the boundary between sea and land grows thin, where creatures of legend still hold dominion over ancient waters. Torres had maintained his duties as first mate, despite the revelation of his betrayal, though the crew now watched him with suspicious eyes and conversations ceased when he approached. His daughter's safety still hung in the balance, and Gareth's escape from Skull Island meant the threat remained very real. "Captain," Torres said quietly, approaching Silas at the bow, "I know my betrayal has cost me your trust, but I must speak plainly. The men are frightened. The hourglass's effect on time is unnatural. Some are beginning to wonder if we're still among the living or if we've crossed into some supernatural realm." Silas studied his former friend's face, seeing genuine remorse alongside the ever-present worry for his captive daughter. "And what do you think, Torres? Are we still alive?" "I think," Torres replied carefully, "that we stopped being entirely alive the moment we chose to pursue cursed treasure. But I also think that forward is the only direction that leads to any kind of redemption." The approach to Mermaid's Rest proved unlike anything they'd experienced at Skull Island. Where the first island had been hostile and threatening, this place radiated an otherworldly beauty that was almost hypnotic in its appeal. Crystal-clear waters revealed coral gardens of impossible colors, while schools of fish moved in formations too perfect to be natural. But it was the singing that truly marked their entry into supernatural waters. A chorus of voices rose from the depths, harmonizing in languages that predated human speech. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, promising peace and fulfillment to any who would simply surrender to its call. "Cover your ears," the parrot commanded urgently. The mermaids of this place are not the benevolent spirits of sailors' tales. They are ancient beings who view human souls as delicacies to be savored. Magnus was the first to succumb to the supernatural music. The massive Norwegian stood transfixed at the ship's rail, his eyes fixed on shapes, moving beneath the crystal waters. Without warning, he swung one leg over the rail, as if preparing to dive. "Magnus, no!" Briggs caught the cook's arm, struggling against strength far greater than his own. "It's the song making you do this." But Magnus shook him off with gentle determination. "Can't you hear them calling? They promise such beautiful things, reunion with my grandmother, endless feasts in halls beneath the waves, peace from the storms that rage in mortal hearts." Silas drew his father's cursed cutlass, not to threaten his loyal cook, but to test a theory that had been forming in his mind. The moment the blade cleared its sheath, the supernatural singing faltered, as if the sword's dark history gave it power over other cursed forces. "The blade knows its own kind," the parrot observed, with something like approval. "Cursed steel recognizes cursed magic, and each diminishes the other's power." With the siren song weakened, Magnus shook his head in confusion, stepping back from the rail with obvious embarrassment. "Captain, what came over me?" "Supernatural influence," Silas replied, keeping the cutlass drawn as more shapes began rising from the depths. "Stay alert, all of you. We're entering waters where reality itself bends to ancient will." The mermaids that emerged from the crystalline depths were nothing like the beautiful creatures of sailors' legends. These beings bore the marks of millennia spent in ocean depths, pale skin that had never known sunlight, eyes like black pearls that reflected no light, and smiles filled with teeth designed for tearing flesh rather than gentle kisses. But their leader was different. She rose from the water with grace that belonged to no earthly creature, her beauty so perfect it seemed to emanate its own light. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of ages spent ruling over these supernatural waters. "Welcome, seekers of the siren's shell," she said, her words somehow audible, despite the distance between ship and sea. "I am Nerea, guardian of the second treasure. Few mortals have reached these waters with artifacts of power already in their possession." The parrot's voice carried new urgency. "Beware, Captain, she can sense the hourglass's presence, and she covets its power over time. Mermaids are immortal but not immune to the desire for greater dominion over the forces that shape existence." The revelation came not from the parrot's beak, but from a voice that emerged from deep within its throat, older, warier, unmistakably human. As Nerea's supernatural presence pressed against the ship, the crimson bird began to glow with an inner light that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Forgive me, Captain Blackwood," the voice said, no longer filtered through avian vocal cords, but speaking with the clear tones of a man long thought dead. "I could maintain the deception no longer, not when the truth might be the only thing that saves us all." Silas staggered backward as the parrot's form began to shift and shimmer, revealing glimpses of something else within. The translucent outline of an elderly man with intelligent eyes and a beard white as sea foam. "My name is Ezra Thorne, and I was Captain Redbeard's trusted advisor before your father and his companions murdered us all on the beach of Dead Man's Cay. My soul was bound to this form by powers I barely understand, condemned to carry the burden of Redbeard's secrets until a worthy heir could be found." Torres crossed himself, his face pale with the shock of supernatural revelation. "A ghost. We've been taking orders from a ghost, trapped in a bird's body." "Not trapped," Ezra corrected gently, the parrot's form stabilizing though the human outline remained visible within. "When the killing began, I used the last of my strength to perform a binding ritual I'd learned from a Caribbean witch doctor. Better to exist as a guardian spirit than to allow my knowledge to die with my flesh." Magnus found his voice first among the stunned crew. But why reveal yourself now? Why maintain the deception for so long? Because Ezra replied, his spectral form pointing toward the water, where Nerea waited with predatory patience. She can destroy the souls of the living, but she has no power over the already dead. And because the final test requires you to understand exactly what you're fighting for. The mermaid queen's laughter rang across the water like silver bells mixed with breaking glass. How touching! The dead counselor reveals himself to save his precious mortal. But you forget, Ezra Thorne. I knew you when you wore flesh and walked on land. You were no hero then, merely another greedy pirate seeking treasure for its own sake. Ezra's ghostly features showed profound sadness. She speaks truth, Captain. I was no saint in life. I helped Redbeard acquire his treasure through means that cost innocent lives. My binding to this form was as much punishment as preservation. The water around the ship began to churn as more mermaids surfaced, their inhuman faces eager for the violence that seemed inevitable. But Nerea raised a pale hand, commanding their patience with the authority of absolute rule. I offer you a bargain, Captain Blackwood, she called out, her voice carrying hypnotic undertones that made the crew lean forward, despite themselves. Give me the golden hourglass and I will grant you safe passage to claim the siren's shell. Refuse and my children will drag you and your men to the depths, where you will spend eternity as our plaything. Don't listen to her, Ezra urged, his spectral form growing more solid as his urgency increased. The shell holds the power to command all sea life, but only if claimed by one who understands that dominion over nature must be balanced with respect for it. In her hands it would become a weapon of terrible destruction. Silas found himself caught between impossible choices. The golden hourglass had already begun affecting his ship and crew in ways he didn't fully understand. Adding the siren's shell to their collection of supernatural artifacts would multiply the dangers exponentially. What happens if we take all three artifacts? He asked Ezra directly. What was Redbeard's true purpose in gathering such power? The ghostly advisor's expression grew heavy with ancient sorrow. He planned to use them to reshape the Caribbean itself, to create a realm where pirates could rule without interference from European powers, where the sea itself would serve as protector and provider. But power of that magnitude corrupts even the best intentions. The curse that protects these trees exists to prevent any one person from wielding such dominion. Nerea's patience was clearly wearing thin. The water around the ship had begun to glow with bioluminescent creatures that swirled in patterns too complex to be natural. Choose quickly, mortals. My offer expires with the setting sun, and darkness brings hunger to the deep places. There's something else, Ezra continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The soul crystal that powers my existence in this form, it's hidden in the third treasure location. If you succeed in claiming all three artifacts, you'll have the power to restore me to life or to grant me the peace of final death. The weight of that revelation settled over Silas like a shroud. His supernatural guide, the one being who truly understood the dangers they faced, was asking him to hold the power of life and death over souls themselves. The responsibility seemed too great for any mortal man to bear. The betrayal came at dawn, as Silas prepared to dive for the siren's shell in the crystal depths below. Torres stood behind him with a loaded pistol pressed against his captain's skull, while Gareth's ship, the Iron Maiden, emerged from the morning mist like a predator that had been stalking its prey through the night. "I'm sorry, Captain," Torres whispered, his voice thick with genuine regret. "But Gareth has my daughter aboard his ship. He says she dies if I don't deliver you and the artifacts to him." Magnus roared with rage and moved toward the first mate, but Torres swung the pistol toward the Norwegian cook. "Don't make me kill you two, old friend. I've betrayed enough people I care about already." Ezra's ghostly form shimmered with supernatural anger within the parrot's body. "Fool! You think Gareth will honor his word? He'll kill your daughter the moment he has what he wants, then throw you to the sharks for good measure." "Maybe," Torres replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "But maybe she lives if I cooperate. Certainty of her death if I don't." The choice is simple mathematics. Iron Tooth Gareth's boarding party swarmed onto the Serpent's Tooth with the efficiency of men who had practiced such operations countless times. Their leader followed moments later, his iron teeth gleaming in the morning sun as he surveyed his prize with obvious satisfaction. "Captain Blackwood," Gareth said with mock courtesy, "how kind of you to gather these supernatural treasures in one convenient location. And dear Ezra, still playing the role of helpful guide, I see." The parrot's form blazed with spectral light, as Ezra's fury manifested invisible energy. "You murdered innocent men for gold, Gareth. Now you seek to compound that sin by stealing artifacts that could reshape the world itself." "Innocent?" Gareth laughed, the sound like grinding metal. "Pirates are never innocent, my ethereal friend. We're all murderers and thieves by choice. The only difference is scope and ambition." But even as Gareth spoke, dark symbols began appearing on his forehead, twisted marks that seemed to writhe and pulse with malevolent life. The betrayer's brand, the supernatural punishment that marked those who broke sacred oaths, was manifesting with unprecedented speed. "The curse," Ezra breathed, his spectral form growing brighter. "It's accelerating because of the artifact's presence. The supernatural concentration is amplifying all forms of divine justice." Torres gasped as similar marks began appearing on his own skin, spreading down his arms like living tattoos. "What's happening to me?" "You swore an oath of loyalty to your captain," Ezra explained, his voice carrying the weight of supernatural law. "Breaking that oath in the presence of cursed artifacts carries immediate consequences." Gareth snarled and raised his own pistol, aiming it at Silas's heart. "Then we'll finish this quickly before the curse can claim us. The artifacts will be mine, along with whatever power they contain." But as he pulled the trigger, time itself seemed to slow around them. The golden hourglass, responding to the intense supernatural activity, activated without conscious direction. The musket ball crawled through the air like a thing suspended in amber, while everyone aboard the ship moved with dreamlike slowness. Everyone except Silas, who found himself able to move normally within the temporal distortion. He sidestepped the crawling bullet and drew his father's cursed cutlass, its dark blade humming with recognition of the supernatural forces at play. "The curse recognizes its own," he said to Gareth, whose eyes widened in slow horror as he realized his predicament. "My father's blade has been waiting 30 years to balance the scales of justice." But even as Silas raised the sword, he hesitated. Killing Gareth might satisfy the demands of supernatural justice, but it would also damn his own soul to the same cycle of vengeance that had claimed his father. The betrayer's brand on Torres's skin was spreading faster now, covering his entire body with symbols that burned like fire. "Captain," he gasped through the temporal distortion. "My daughter, please." "Gareth's daughter is already dead," Ezra revealed with brutal honesty. "She died of fever 2 weeks ago, but he's been hiding the truth to maintain his hold over Torres. The betrayal was for nothing, a dead child's ghost used as leverage against a father's love." Torres screamed, a sound that somehow penetrated the temporal distortion with raw anguish. The knowledge that his betrayal had been not only pointless but based on a lie seemed to accelerate the brand's effect. His entire body began to glow with supernatural fire as the curse prepared to exact its final price. Magnus found his voice within the slowed time. "Captain, we have to choose. Save Torres despite his betrayal, or let justice take its course." The weight of decision pressed down on Silas like the ocean depths. Around them, mermaids circled in the slowed water, waiting to see how human concepts of justice and mercy would play out in the presence of artifacts that could reshape reality itself. The battle erupted with supernatural fury as time resumed its natural flow, the golden hourglass's power exhausted by the temporal distortion. Silas threw himself sideways as Gareth's delayed musket ball finally completed its journey, the lid sphere splintering the ship's rail where he had stood moments before. "Magnus Briggs, defend the artifact," Silas shouted, drawing his father's cursed cutlass as Iron Tooth's crew swarmed across the deck. The blade sang through the air with unnatural eagerness, as if 30 years of restraint had finally been released. The cursed steel met Gareth's own sword with a clash that sent supernatural sparks cascading across the deck. Where the two enchanted blades touched, the very air seemed to crack and splinter, revealing glimpses of otherworldly realms beyond. "Your father's blade knows its purpose," Gareth snarled, his iron teeth gleaming as he pressed his attack. "It thirsts for the blood of those who betrayed its original master." But even as they dueled, the real battle raged in the waters around the ship. Nerea and her mermaid court had joined the fray. Their supernatural song now turned to warfare, as they pulled Gareth's men into the depths with claws that could rend steel. The crystal waters turned crimson as ancient magic clashed with mortal desperation. Torres, still marked by the spreading betrayer's brand, fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. The supernatural tattoos covering his body seemed to give him inhuman strength, allowing him to hurl Gareth's pirates overboard with casual violence. "The curse makes him stronger even as it kills him," Ezra observed, his spectral form now fully visible as the concentration of supernatural forces made his ghostly presence undeniable. "But the brand's fire will consume him within minutes, unless what?" Silas demanded, parrying a vicious thrust from Gareth's enchanted blade. "Unless you use the hourglass to reverse time around him specifically, undoing his betrayal before the curse can complete its work. But doing so will drain the artifact's power completely." Young Briggs cried out as one of Gareth's men grabbed him from behind, a wicked knife pressed against his throat. "Captain, they've got the shell." Indeed, several of Iron-Tooth's crew had managed to dive for the siren's shell during the chaos, their leader emerging from the crystal depths with the conch-shaped artifact clutched in his bloodied hands. The moment his fingers closed around the shell, every sea creature in the surrounding waters turned toward the ship with predatory interest. "Now I command the very oceans themselves," Gareth laughed, even as he continued his deadly dance with Silas's cursed blade. "Surrender the hourglass and I might allow some of your crew to live." But the shell's power came with a price he hadn't anticipated. The ancient artifact's connection to all sea life meant Gareth felt every death in the water around them, every mermaid's claw that found flesh, every man who drowned in the supernatural chaos. His face contorted with agony as the psychic weight of oceanic violence crashed over him. Magnus had cornered 3 of Gareth's men near the ship's wheel, his massive fists dealing out punishment with methodical precision. But even his strength couldn't hold back the tide of boarders indefinitely. "Captain," the Norwegian called out between crushing blows, "whatever you're going to do it quickly." The decision crystallized in Silas's mind with perfect clarity. He activated the golden hourglass one final time, focusing its temporal power not on the entire battle, but on Torres alone. The first mate's body began to glow with golden light as time reversed around him, the betrayer's brand slowly fading as his betrayal was undone. But the effort left Silas vulnerable to Gareth's next attack. Iron-Tooth's blade sliced deep across his ribs, sending the pirate captain staggering backward toward the ship's rail. "Foolish sentiment," Gareth sneered, raising his sword for the killing blow. "You've exhausted your temporal artifact to save a traitor." The strike never landed. Torres, freed from the curse's influence and driven by guilt over his betrayal, threw himself between Gareth and his captain. Iron-Tooth's blade punched through the first mate's chest with a wet sound that carried across the battle-torn deck. "My loyalty was never in question," Torres gasped, his hands closing around Gareth's sword blade. "Only my methods were flawed." With his last strength, Torres drove his own cutlass into Gareth's side, the mortal wound causing the rival captain to drop the siren's shell. The conch artifact clattered across the deck, its power suddenly unleashed and uncontrolled. Every sea creature within miles began converging on their location, drawn by the shell's chaotic influence. Sharks, whales, and things from the deep places rose toward the surface with mindless hunger, while Nerea's court of mermaids prepared to claim both artifacts for their ancient queen. The master key, Ezra shouted over the supernatural chaos. It's the only thing that can control all three artifacts simultaneously. But it's hidden at Storm's End, and will never survive the journey through these cursed waters. Storm's End Island rose from the Caribbean waters like a cathedral built by gods and abandoned to time, its towering spires of black rock wreathed in perpetual tempest. Lightning danced between the stone peaks with unnatural precision, while thunder rolled across the waves in rhythmic patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random weather. The Serpent's Tooth limped toward the island's treacherous shore, her hull scarred by the supernatural battle at Mermaid's Rest, and her crew reduced to barely half its original number. Torres lay wrapped in sailcloth on the main deck, his body still and peaceful despite the violent circumstances of his death. Silas had insisted on bringing his former first mate to the final island, understanding that some journeys require the presence of those who began them. The golden hourglass sat powerless in its protective case, its temporal energies exhausted by the effort of reversing Torres's betrayal. The siren's shell hung silent from Magnus's belt, its chaotic power contained only by the Norwegian's surprising ability to commune with sea creatures through pure, uncomplicated respect for their nature. The island's storm is not natural weather, Ezra explained, his spectral form now permanently visible within the parrot's body. It's a manifestation of the Crown of Storm's power, a test that has raged for 30 years waiting for someone worthy to claim dominion over it. Young Briggs, promoted to first mate by necessity rather than desire, studied the island through their damaged spyglass. "Captain, there's no safe bar I can see. The lightning strikes every few seconds, and the rocks look sharp enough to gut a whale." "Then we swim," Silas announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had accepted that some paths could only be walked alone. The final test was always meant for one person to face. Magnus shook his head with stubborn determination. "With respect, Captain, we've come too far together to abandon you now. If you swim, we swim." The approach to Storm's End proved as treacherous as its appearance suggested. They had to abandon the Serpent's Tooth a quarter-mile from shore, her draught too deep for the shallow waters that surrounded the island. Swimming through the supernatural storm felt like trying to navigate while the gods themselves waged war overhead. Lightning turned the world to brilliant white and crushing black in alternating moments, while thunder shook the water with such force that Silas felt it in his bones. But somehow, guided by Ezra's supernatural knowledge or simple pirate's luck, they reached the narrow strip of volcanic sand that served as the island's only beach. "The entrance to the final chamber lies at the island's heart," Ezra gasped, his ghostly form flickering like a candle in high wind. "But the path will test each of you differently. This island reads your deepest fears and makes them manifest." They had barely taken a dozen steps inland when the volcanic rock beneath their feet began to shift and flow, forming shapes that belonged to nightmares rather than natural geology. Silas found himself facing a perfect recreation of his father, Miguel Santos, complete with the cruel smile and gold-capped teeth that had haunted his childhood. "My disappointing son," the phantom Miguel sneered, his voice carrying all the contempt Silas remembered from those final years before his father's disappearance. "Still playing at being a pirate captain when you lack the stomach for true ruthlessness. Still believing that mercy makes you strong instead of weak." But Silas had learned too much about himself during this supernatural journey to be broken by old wounds. "You're not my father," he said calmly, drawing his cutlass. "You're just fear wearing a familiar face." The phantom laughed, but its form began to waver as Silas's certainty grew stronger. "Am I? Or am I the voice of truth you've spent 30 years trying to ignore? You'll never be the leader these men deserve. You'll never be worthy of the power you seek." "Perhaps not," Silas admitted, his blade steady despite the supernatural storm raging overhead. "But I'll die trying to be better than you were." The phantom of Miguel Santos dissolved like sea foam as Silas's sword passed through it, taking with it the last of the self-doubt that had plagued him since childhood. Magnus faced his own trial, the ghostly form of his grandmother, the woman who had raised him and filled his head with stories of honor and supernatural wisdom. She spoke to him in Norwegian, her words carrying disappointment that cut deeper than any blade. Briggs confronted a vision of himself as an old man, bitter and broken by a lifetime of following leaders who led him only to destruction. But all three men emerged from their supernatural trials stronger rather than broken, understanding that true courage lay not in the absence of fear, but in the choice to act despite it. At the island's center, protected by a circle of standing stones that hummed with barely contained power, stood a pedestal holding the crown of storms, a diadem of silver and sapphire that seemed to contain miniature tempests within each jewel, and beside it, glowing with soft inner light, lay the master key that could unite all three artifacts under a single will. The master key felt warm in Silas's palm, its intricate design pulsing with the rhythm of his heartbeat, as if the ancient artifact recognized its rightful bearer. Around him, the three supernatural treasures began to resonate with harmonious energy, the drained golden hourglass slowly regaining its temporal glow, the siren's shell humming with oceanic power, and the crown of storms crackling with barely contained lightning. But it was the fourth artifact, hidden within the pedestal's base, that drew Silas's attention with magnetic force. The soul crystal that Ezra had spoken of emerged from its ancient resting place as a sphere of pure light, containing what appeared to be swirling galaxies of memory and consciousness. 30 years I have waited for this moment, Ezra's voice said, though it no longer came from the parrot's throat, but seemed to emanate from the crystal itself. 30 years of existing between life and death, carrying the burden of secrets that should have died with my flesh. Magnus and Briggs stood at respectful distance, understanding that they were witnessing something beyond mortal comprehension. The soul crystal rose from Silas's hands, floating in the air between them with serene grace. "You have the power now, Captain Blackwood," Ezra continued, his spectral form becoming more solid as the crystal's influence grew stronger. "You can restore me to life. Grant me the second chance that every soul deserves. The crystal contains enough spiritual energy to rebuild my body from the very atoms of the sea." The temptation was enormous. Ezra had been more than a guide. He had become a friend, a wise counselor, whose supernatural knowledge had saved their lives countless times. The thought of losing that wisdom, that companionship, felt like contemplating the amputation of his own limb. "All," Ezra said, more softly, "you can grant me what I truly desire. Release from this endless existence, peace from the burdens that have defined my spiritual imprisonment for 3 decades. Silas looked into the crystal's swirling depths and saw not just Ezra's memories, but his pain, 30 years of watching the world change while remaining frozen in the moment of his violent death. 30 years of carrying guilt for the lives his greed had cost. 30 years of existing without the simple human comforts of food, sleep, or loving touch. "What would you choose?" Silas asked, understanding that this decision would define not just Ezra's fate, but his own character as the wielder of such ultimate power. The spectral advisor smiled with profound sadness and equally profound relief. "I choose peace, my friend. I choose the rest that has been denied me for far too long. Some journeys are meant to have endings." With trembling hands, Silas focused his will through the master key, directing the soul crystal's power not toward restoration, but toward release. The sphere of light began to expand, its inner galaxies spinning faster as 30 years of accumulated spiritual energy prepared for final dispersal. "Thank you," Ezra whispered, his form becoming translucent as the crystal's power flowed through him, "for showing me that redemption doesn't always require second chances. Sometimes it requires accepting the consequences of our choices with grace." The soul crystal shattered like a star going supernova, its light washing over the entire island with warm radiance, and in that moment of dissolution, Silas felt Ezra's gratitude, his peace, his final gift of wisdom. That true power lay not in the ability to command supernatural forces, but in the wisdom to know when not to use them. The crown of storms settled onto Silas's head of its own accord, but instead of the overwhelming surge of dominion he had expected, he felt only gentle connection to the sea, to the sky, to the natural forces that shaped the Caribbean world. The artifacts weren't meant to grant absolute power, he realized, but to serve as bridges between human will and natural harmony. Magnus approached with the rebuilt compass they had recovered from the serpent's tooth, its needle now pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward whatever destination the bearer most needed to reach. "Where to now, Captain?" Silas studied the simple instrument, understanding that it represented something far more valuable than supernatural treasure. It represented choice, the freedom to chart his own course without the weight of his father's sins or the burden of cursed artifacts. "Home," he said simply, though he realized he was no longer sure where that might be, wherever that turns out to be. As they sailed away from Storm's End Island in a small boat, conjured by the Crown's power over weather and tide, Silas made a decision that would have surprised his younger self. The 3 supernatural artifacts went overboard one by one, returning to the depths where they could rest, until someone worthier than any pirate had need of them. The compass remained, pointing always toward whatever future awaited a man who had learned that the greatest treasure was the wisdom to choose, compassion over power, mercy over vengeance, and peace over the endless pursuit of gold that had defined his family's bloody legacy.